I think it's quite interesting that we have a session with this title in this festival, which has as its theme currents of change. And if you noticed as you came into the venue here, there's an installation right at the entrance where you have a huge clock-like structure, uh, all along the face of which you have human figures in different formations. I think it conveys a lot about change and the currents of change that we as human beings face. And we could not have a better session than this, I think, to do justice to that theme, because we're talking about an author whose work has dealt with every kind of complexity in a changing scenario. Human beings in very dynamic relationships which keep changing and trying to meet the challenges of the changing times. That's been the sum and substance of your work as a novelist and as a critic too. So, as a writer, who's created or given us a lot of fluidity in the characters. Here's a writer who has not ever branded his characters. When he's often referred to as a queer novelist, and I think the very word queer there calls for introspection, because here's somebody who believes that anything that is not the norm, anything that goes beyond the convention and the accepted is queer. That's actually, I think, a very liberating definition of the word queer itself. And that's exactly what I found in the very free creations who people your novels. They cannot be pinned down or labeled as this or that. A normal strategy one would find in novels, who engage with the queer would be to offset the queer against a background of the conventional and the norm. But in novel after novel, you have given us characters who, cannot either be called good or bad or black or white or queer or normal. So that is the kind of, that's the fluidity that I would like to pin this conversation on. So do begin this conversation with that note about the very fluid creations who people your works.
Sure. Thank you so much. And it's, I must say, it's always a delight to be back to Kerala and Mathrubhumi. I think it's my favorite reading state, and I have so many wonderful readers here.
Maybe
and
you could hold the mic
really
closer.
Yeah, so it's really wonderful to be here because I think the reading culture in this place is really, really humbling. So thank you so much for having me. And I'm especially honored to be in conversation with Bindu, who's been such a really perceptive and sensitive reader of my novels. So I think what you said, I learned something about my own work from the way you talk about it. So that's really wonderful. I think you're absolutely right. I think I have been called a queer writer, but whose writings are queer. Yeah. But I think I do have a very expansive definition of queerness, which I think intrigues some people, makes some people happy, makes some people angry. Because it's, as you rightly said, that anything that is not quite fits into the sort of heteronormative system for me is kind of queer. And especially I'm fascinated by desires which will never be fulfilled, which will always be deferred. And I think that is the foundation of our classical literature too. If you look at Meghdud, the idea of Biraho, the idea of the lover who will never be there, I think that kind of thing really fascinates me. And in many ways, and one doesn't think about these things while writing. So my second novel, The Firebird, is about this young boy's obsession with his mother's life as an actress. And clearly there's a kind of an Oedipal connection there. When she sees her on stage, when she's kissing another man, when she's dying, there's a kind of an obsession. And this is deeply personal for me because my mother was an actress. This is the novel, The Firebird. And even though the story is made up, I have these memories, this magical, haunting memories of watching a play from the wings, walking into the green room and seeing my own mother made up. And at the same time, this memories of how a society thinks of an actress. Oh, a woman plays this kind of a role, she must be that kind of a woman. Oh, what is she doing going out this hour of the night, kind of dressed up? Oh, only one kind of woman goes out at 6 in the evening, and we know what she's like. So in a way, I think this is about a boy who grows up with a strange mix of pride and shame, also a kind of a desire, I think. And that is what mixed with the society's attitude to actresses. And and I never thought of desire quite that way, because I was obviously going back to my childhood experience of watching my mother like this. But I realized I ended up writing a novel about desire. I ended up writing a novel about the confusion between art and life. Or even in my other novel, The Scent of God, which is celebrated as a gay novel, which was here at the Mathrubhumi Awards a few years ago. I did go to a boarding school run by Hindu monastic order, and I remember it's a fascinating experience. It's a saffron monastic order, it's celibate, and yet these are young boys who are coming of age. So you're singing, sitting in a prayer hall, in the smell of incense, flowers, and your knees are touching another boy. So it was a fascinating connection, confluence of the spiritual and the erotic at the same time. And for these boys, it eventually becomes like, okay, a monastic space, what does it really mean? A monastic space which is, if there's no women, then it must be celibate. And it reminds me of the whole discussion around Sabarimala temple in Kerala, that why women are not allowed at certain times of the month, and that ensures you're celibate. And I'm like, oh, if women are not allowed, then that's celibate. That's such a cute thought. That's such an innocent, naive thought. And I think that powered that novel, that idea of monastic purity and male presence. And I think in many ways, because I was talking about the sexuality of very young boys, these are 13, 14, 15, 16, and I think it ended up being quite controversial, because the novel was published just 4 months after Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code was sort of shut off, so homosexuality was no longer criminal. And this was one of the first gay novels to come out, and there was a lot of expectation like what it should be. But it was a very quiet novel also, because you're talking of children or teenagers' sexual lives, also in the context of monastic purity. So it's a very dangerous subject. So that is, that's how I've always thought about it. As well as in Remains of the Body, marriage comes into the play with a middle finger, where I try to retell the Drona Ekalavya story in a modern campus novel, in a situation where Drona and Ekalavya have fallen in love with each other. So how I'm interested in myths, because I think as teacher, we see the Ekalavya story everywhere. So for me, that kind of desire is very much there, and I think that drives the narrative. But I think unfulfilled desire also powers the sentence. There's a certain energy. It's like what Keats said with the Ode to Nightingale. Oh, the kiss will never happen. And because the kiss will never happen, it'll always remain exciting. And all the desires I talk about are, well, they'll never be fulfillment, or not the kind of fulfillment society approves. And I think that lack of fulfillment is what has always driven me as a writer.
Yeah, one can really feel that, the strength of that unfulfilled desire in every page of yours. I'll come back to The Scent of God and the middle finger soon, because it talks about a very big area that could open up, that could be opened up for discussion, that is education. But I'll come back to that. But taking off from The Firebird, where you have the young boy and his very complicated relationship with his mother, or the parenthood in itself. Similarly, The Remains of the Body is a novel which has, I would say, problematized marriage. Marriage is, I think, looked at from various points of view. You have the Kaustav and Avik and Sunetra here, who again, make us introspect on the very institution of marriage, of what an ideal conjugal relationship or marital relationship is like. So I'm very interested in knowing how these characters came to you, the moment of inspiration, and what is it that drives you, to forward with these characters? How do they take you forward? These characters who again cannot be branded as either the ideal wife or the ideal husband, or they do not belong to the ideal relationship either, in conventional terms.
Right. Well, I like to often sometimes say marriage is a bit like sort of blue cheese. With time, it starts to stink, but only the true connoisseur can appreciate the stench. There's something about the stench that you kind of like. I think this is something, that generation after us, that today's young generation already know. It's probably, I think many of them will not enter marriages. I think marriage is really, it's a functional system. I think it's good for society, it's good for property, it's good for, social structure. I think it has very little to do with personal happiness. I think personal happiness is not the focus of marriage. You get a structure, you get a certain stability, but I think the whole idea that you will have something that will satisfy your financial, your social, your romantic, everything is kind of completely absurd. It's not that you don't have moments of happiness, but it's really kind of, so I think, and I think, people are already, there are cultures and countries where people have already left that behind. So I think that is definitely, and Marxists have also critiqued it. It's a system kind of about property, about the father's name and all of that. So there are a lot of political aspects to marriage. Clearly the kind of desire I talk about doesn't sit well. And yet marriage is a fascinating subject for writers. Writers have been historically, repeatedly been drawn to marriage because it's such an important institution. I mean, just to take 19th century European novels, why were so many novels about adultery? Think of Flaubert's novel, Madame Bovary, there's a dead marriage, of course, Anna Karenina, and the American critic Lionel Trilling has a wonderful essay about this, a very dangerous essay, where he says that, see, true love must always be dangerous. True love must always be forbidden. You cannot make true love the normative. And then he says that, see, in the 19th century, marriage had nothing to do with love. Especially with the European aristocracy, it was about property, it was about kingdoms, it was about all these different things. So it was expected that you seek romance outside of marriage. It's completely expected. So adultery was a common theme. Now in the 20th century, now adultery has also become boring. Adultery is also not exciting enough to become a subject. And then he says what is the most dangerous part. He's talking about Vladimir Nabokov's Lolita, that there, a love between a 52-year-old man and a 12-year-old girl, which is essentially pedophilia, that is the relationship that occupies the space of the dangerous. So that is therefore the subject of true romance. It's a very problematic statement, but I think in some ways, I think it's quite fascinating that marriage is so limiting, and yet, I'm thinking of what Shashi Deshpande says in that Long Silence, that, a husband and wife are two bullocks tied to a yoke. Think of, that's such a beautiful metaphor. Two bullocks tied to a yoke. So you're not really like each other, and yet you're tied to a yoke, so you have to kind of go in that direction. And I think that is what in Remains of the Body, that is kind of my subject, that here's what happens when a very brilliant woman, a brilliant and ambitious woman, but whose career hasn't gone quite well, is married to a very mediocre man, but who's successful. And that gentle kind of shepherding, so these are two scientists I'm talking about, they're both scientists, and the gentle bullying that the husband is like, honey, I know what's good for you, this is what, you can't really do this. And then this is where I think Kaustav's situation, the kind of, I think in many ways this novel is driven by this whole thought that why are we not attracted to multiple genders? Why are we limited by our desire? Most people, there are very few people who can say that we are attracted to multiple genders. Why are we attracted to certain? And I think this is where these two childhood friends who've seen each other's bodies and know each other's bodies so closely, and yet they, one of them is wondering, why is it that I'm not attracted to him? And then, of course, he has a relationship with his wife. And then the question becomes, is it really his wife I'm interested in, or am I trying to wonder, is this wife's body has known my friend's body in a certain way? So it's a kind of vicarious intimacy. Is it okay if I read a little bit from
Yes,
there?
I think
Maybe I'll
that,
read a
yeah.
brief passage for you to show. And this is, I think, I mean, it really fascinated me that what happens when somebody you think about a lot, say your best friend, somebody you've known since childhood, and then you are drawn to that best friend's partner. And then the question for this protagonist is that, am I really drawn to the partner? Or is this my way to touch a body which I cannot touch otherwise? And this is kind of the climactic realization which I think comes to this couple who are having this adulterous relationship. So I'll just read that 2 pages. She got off. Quietly, she lay next to him. Tell me something, she said quietly. Do you like to touch me? What do you think? He brushed his fingers slowly across her lips. You're turned on by the moment, but the whole time you're thinking of someone else. What's this supposed to mean? Your mind is with Avik. He's all you think about, don't you? It's hard not to think about him. Look at where we are. I'm not talking about that. I don't care. I'm done with him. Her words were harsh, hurtful pebbles. But you'll never be done with him, will you? She asked. I don't know, he said. How I'll live with this between us. Kaustav, she sat up. Her naked skin was magnetic. You will live with it, she said. If you've done it, you will. But I felt cheated when I tried to reach out to you, she whispered. I'm really trying to, but you don't even see me. He tried to say something, but he couldn't. You're really with him even now, aren't you? Her eyes were full, wavering pool staring into his soul. A storm blasted through his head. He wished he could fly away from her, from everybody. His desire had held him to the ground, a moist, slippery, delicious ground. You never really wanted me, she said. You wanted to hold my hand and comfort me, but you didn't want this, did you? The storm raged. He could hear it, a windy revenge in his chest. You really want him. You don't know it. She squeezed his hand. I know his body well, he whispered, but I don't know it at all, Kaustav. She whispered back, this was all a mistake. Mistake? He asked. It wouldn't be a mistake, Kaustav, if you really wanted this between us. Were you really drawn to me? She looked into his eyes. It's a sad thing, he said, but yes, it felt natural. You can't face the truth, but there's something terrible about this. She was melting by the minute, becoming distant, a mere thought with a voice. You wanted something of him, she said, her voice soft but clear, but something of him that couldn't touch in your own life. Her skin was such a joy, the vortex of so much desire. I had trusted you, she said, with my rage and with my body. I love your rage, but you never cared for my body. Why did you touch it? You have a beautiful body, Sue, but a strange heart. You have a beautiful mind, Kaustav, and what a strange, strange body. A body that doesn't know what it really wants or can own up to it. She sat up, put on her bra. You still think you're sleeping with me, but you know who you're really sleeping with. He felt struck by lightning. It was as if a bolt had sliced him open. What could he tell her? He didn't have the language. Please, Sue, I don't want you to go. Stay. Why are you doing this, Kaustav? This was a mistake. She slipped her arms into the sleeves. I wanted you, Kaustav. I really wanted you with all of myself. He reached out, held her hand. She pulled back. Please, no, you've had what you wanted of me. She booked an Uber. It was on its way. Go back to your friend, she said. He needs you more than ever. So I think this is a pretty kind of dangerous way to talk about queer desire with a woman in between. But I realize that, you know, people are, queer desires come to people in so many strange ways. And when the woman realizes it, I think it's a shock for her. But I think you're right. I've always been drawn to describing desire in very strange ways.
Yeah. And the seeds of those desire, they go a long way back. And that's, I think, what the novel, The Scent of God, conveys to us in the childhood friendships, in the childhood bonds that the young boys make in that school run by the monastery. Could you shed more light on that, the way, you know, those relationships continue long into your adult life and affect all your future relationships?
So there's a very funny story about how I think this novel, I mean, not came to me. I mean, I wrote this novel after 20 years after I lived in that school. And as I said, I did go to that school and I did see all these love stories happening around me. It was quite powerful. Unfortunately, I was a very shy and awkward person, so I couldn't participate in those love stories as much as I wanted to, but I was quite left out. But there was a very strange role I had. So people quickly found out that I could write. So I got flooded with requests to write love letters. I've written an essay about this in the Hindu a few years ago. I don't know if anybody's read it, but it's quite fascinating when someone comes and this was, I'm talking about late 80s, early 90s, you know, and obviously people actually wrote letters by hand. And it was really interesting. People would come and say, "Oh, I have a crush on this boy. Will you write a letter for me? Write a letter on my behalf?" And believe me, I must have written dozens of letters. I must have written dozens of letters, and it's a really interesting exercise when you're writing a love letter for somebody else, because you have to feel a desire you don't have. So you kind of have to feel that crush. I'm like, oh, I'm going to, you know, there's this guy who sort of had this big crush on this guy who, dark guy, played football really well, and I look at the way he plays, and I'm like, okay, I have to become this person, and I have to write this letter with this desire. And it's fascinating. And all these years later, I realized it was kind of training to write novels. Because a writer, and this is because I teach creative writing, I tell this to students, being a writer is obviously becoming an intense version of yourself, but you must also become other people. You cannot create characters, you cannot create a kind of a, unless you know what other people feel. In fact, a good writer can create feelings they don't know themselves. They haven't felt themselves. So it was really interesting. Those letters really, you know, kind of got me along, and really funny, confusing thing happens. There was one really hilarious story where one boy, this was about a girl, not about a boy, had a crush on a girl outside the campus. This was in class 11 and 12. And then he found a boy to write letters for him. Oh, you write letters? And then a third boy became the messenger. So this went on for a while. So they were writing letters, and the girl was reading the letters. She was responding, assuming she was writing the letters on her own. We don't know that. But there was a going on. And then after a point of time, the boy said, okay, let's meet. And the girl said, fine, let's meet. Now the question is, who does she want to meet? There are 3 people involved in this chain of letters. So there was a big fight among the boys, like, no, she wants to meet me, I'm the one. No, but I wrote the letters, you know. And then, no, I actually delivered the letters to her. So it was really hilarious. And I think what happened, this panned out quite interestingly, and I've heard in the end, the girl actually ended up marrying one of the 3 boys, but not the boy who had the crush. So clearly, I think chain of desire flies in so many interesting ways. But I think this was the atmosphere, you know, where, and any of you who've lived in a hostel, any of you who've lived in a, especially if it's a religious hostel, I think these novels there have been stories like this in Catholic convents. I don't think, nobody wrote about it in a Hindu context, but I just had to, because it was, and obviously when it happened, you know, obviously the Hindutva was not such a huge political force, certainly not in Bengal. It was just a monastic order, but when I was writing, Hindutva had become a big political force as well. And it's interesting, like that Sabarimala controversy also broke out around this time when I just published the novel. So very much these debates about celibacy, monastic life, and sexuality were kind of in the float. So it's quite fascinating how novels end up reflecting their times. Even though I was talking about a time 20 years ago when we were boys, you know, when we were in school. And yet when I wrote, I realized it sort of becomes a strange mirror of the times in which we live. As well, the debates around sexuality, as well as the debates around Hindutva. So in this novel, of course, there's a village right outside the hostel, which is a poor Muslim village. And the dynamic between the Muslim village and the Hindu order is very interesting. For one thing, the prayers. I remember 5 times we used to hear the sound of azan coming through. And even when we were praying, we were sitting in our prayer hall, we were singing our hymns and bhajans and all of that. And right in the middle, there is this whole thing. The novel opens with a cricket match where there's an India-Pakistan cricket match happening, and there's a lot of excitement, and the whole assumption is that, oh, people in those villages, they're cheering for Pakistan. And that violence, it was a fascinating atmosphere, even in terms of religion and sexuality, which I think we wouldn't know that in 20 years it has taken this massive shape in the country we live in today. But in a child's experience, they were still there in a different form.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for taking us to those formative years, which later played a major role in your career as a writer and also as a teacher of creative writing. So I'm more interested in now looking at the college space, which has again been so beautifully opened up, exposing many of the spots that we would otherwise tend to overlook in a novel called The Middle Finger, which at one level is a very interesting retake on the old story of Ekalavya and the class divide that comes in the way of one's pursuit of education. And at another level is also about the mentor-mentee relationship. So I'm sure both of these have been very close to your heart, both of these themes. So could you share with the audience your world, the world that you have opened up through The Middle Finger?
You can imagine when you have a novel called The Middle Finger, it evokes all kinds of reaction. First of all, as a gift, I'm giving you the middle finger. It takes on a whole different meaning as a gift. But then I tell I have no problem the title being taken that way, but that's not where that word comes from. This actually comes from a fascinating story told by Wendy Doniger, the Hindu scholar of Hinduism, about medieval Jain retelling of the Ekalavya story. I'm sure all of you know the Ekalavya story already, so I don't need to say that. But in Doniger's retelling, what happens is, the Jain retelling, that it was not Drona who asked for the thumb. It was actually Arjun who got so jealous of Ekalavya that, oh, he's so good, I must somehow do something bad to him. So he got Ekalavya to chop off his thumb and said, you must give this Guru Dakshina. And then Drona came to know about this. He was very angry. He said, oh, you urban crook, you've cheated this sincere Bhil, and from now on I'm giving this boon that the Bhil will be able to shoot with his index and middle finger, so even without the tongue. So that's where the title comes from, The Middle Finger, but I have no objection in people thinking of it otherwise. So I think as someone who teaches, before I came to Ashoka, I taught in Stanford for many years, and both Stanford and Ashoka are sort of seen as elite universities, obviously cost and things. And I think this is a question, and not just me, I think anybody who teaches has faced an Ekalavya situation. They must have faced a student who almost feels like they don't belong there. What do I have a right? How do I learn? And it comes out in so many ways. It's not just caste or class, but also the way they speak, maybe the way they speak English, maybe the way they dress, maybe the way, all kinds of things. Maybe they do their hair. And I think I'm sure anybody who's been in a college and a university have been, either a Drona or an Ekalavya or an Arjun. You must have known these roles. And I felt like I must reinvent this story as a contemporary campus novel. How can I not? It's really fascinating. But at the same time, I was very influenced by Plato's Symposium, where Plato talks about a certain erotic connection between the teacher and the student. And this was shortly after the Me Too movement was blasting through academia. It was also blasting through other places, but academia, the whole teacher-student kind of a thing. So I wanted to write, a story where Drona and Ekalavya have feelings for each other. And in my novel, Drona and Ekalavya are both women. Arjun is still a man. But there is a kind of a connection, and yet this disturbing thought that, do I have the right? And I think this is an ongoing question. This is an ongoing question for anyone who seeks education, who has felt like an Ekalavya. Anyone who's been a Drona and felt like, oh, here's my Arjun and here's my Ekalavya, what can I do? And I think this is not confined to academia. This is probably true of any place. Mentorship is a theme which really fascinates me. what does it mean to be mentored by somebody? What does it mean to mentor somebody? Political life needs mentors, corporate life needs mentors. So the power relation between the mentor and the mentee is quite fascinating. And it, of course, of late we've seen it becomes really dangerous when things like romance and sexuality enters into it. So that is something that really draws me. And again, going back to my theme of strange thwarted desire, I wanted to bring that into play in this kind of provocatively titled Middle Finger.
Yeah. And, you're not just a novelist. You have brought in this in your nonfiction writing as well. I'm interested in looking at the powerful ideas that you have expressed through college, the pathways, your work on nonfiction. So, based on your experiences, again, as a teacher, not just of creative writing, but of English literature too, what do you think is going to be the college of the future? As a creative, as a person very closely linked with liberal arts, I know that you've played a role in the national education policy, the drafting of the national education policy too. So could you shed some light on your thoughts on education for today and tomorrow?
Yeah, I think education is the theme that runs through everything I write. My fiction, my non-fiction, my criticism, and because I'm fundamentally interested in how people become who they become. So the word for Bildung, the German word Bildung is education, and the word Bildungsroman is the coming of age story. How do you become the person that you become? And the convention Bildungsroman ends at when you're 20, 21, but I think in some ways our education goes on all our life. And here I have this kind of daytime life as an educator. I think liberal arts education is very empowering. My book College got me involved with the national education policy, where I helped draft parts of that liberal education policy. And I believe in that. But I think there's a dark side, like Freudian id and superego. The superego says all of these things. The id is very aware that education is also a very repressive process. It's a very repressive, it suppresses people, it excludes people, it creates all kinds of power structures. So there's a very dark side to education too. And I think in that side probably comes out in my novels, where, it's almost like, the normal Bildungsroman is like, oh, you come, you get an education, you get a job, you become a father. It was very male. The traditional Bildungsroman was very male, and you become a successful member of society. And I realize I've been writing novels where people do not become that. So in Firebird, Ori, because of his obsession with his mother's life and all that, he becomes a kind of a goon. He falls in with criminals, he falls in with bad elements. In The Scent of God, Yogi moves away from heteronormative, that whole ambition that you study, you go joint, you take the IT exams. He moves away from that. And he also moves away from heteronormative life. So I'm really fascinated. Even the book, The Amateur, which you're holding, I was driven by people who sit at the back benches. So I'm teaching, and I'm like, who's not listening to me? I'm sitting at the back benches and reading another book. And I think our cultural history is full of people who were not paying attention to the lecturers, but they were reading on their own. They were kind of running away, they were cutting class and going to the library. And this is really fascinating, because this is also a study of the history of the British Empire and its education policy. And British Empire all over. I look at the Caribbean islands, I look at India, I look at Africa. It's full of a certain repressive model of education to make clerks, and some of the most striking thinkers were really bored with this. They said, screw all that. I'm going to do my own thing. So if you look at someone like C.L.R. James from Trinidad, or V.S. Naipaul, or if you look at Toru Dutt or Nirodsi Chaudhary, or there's so many figures who read eclectically. The fundamental question is what happens when you read a text about which you know nothing, the amateur. And this is I think a reality of many of us who read Western literature without a context. You grew up in a village where English is hard to come by. You read a text and you're like, what does this really mean? And I realized that some of the most interesting figures turned their ignorance into strength. They started with this really interesting essay by Pankaj Mishra, reading Edmund Wilson in Benares. He was reading Edmund Wilson while in Benares, and had never heard of Edmund Wilson, he'd never heard of Flaubert, the French writer. Now, who are these people? And then, because he didn't know these people, the Edmund Wilson became about caste life in UP. So because he couldn't travel to 19th century France, he brought Flaubert to 20th century UP. And I think this is a way I think many of us read literature. We don't know the context, but we make it our own. And that's also the beauty of literature. So I think the amateur reading, ignorant reading is sometimes more interesting than scholarly reading. Scholarly reading, where you have the knowledge, is actually, sometimes it's politically correct and professionally correct, but it's less interesting. So I think we're really very interested in kind of both education, but its loopholes. Education is a very strange process.
Yeah, there's a chapter in this book called The Amateur. The chapter is titled The Violence of Humanistic Education, and that's exactly what you've been telling us about. And we in the audience, we can relate to what he's been telling us, right? We've heard a lot about the review culture. As soon as movies come out, we have reviewers coming out with the reviews of movies, much to the delight of many an audience, but much to the chagrin and the anger of filmmakers who believe that the fate of the movie ultimately begins to depend on these amateurs. But there's a very beautiful way in which you have talked about that. Allow me to read one sentence from the book, The Amateur, where he says, "I'm hopeful that the bungling acts of reading by these unforgettable peripheral readers, not the mainstream readers, not the educated readers, not the professional readers, but the peripheral readers, as celebratory as resistant, unpredictably affirmative, and eclectically suspicious, will offer some roadmaps for the present, where the reading of older texts, particularly from metropolitan cultures, is to a great extent determined by the vigilance and suspicion of counterculture. In my greatest moment of optimism, I imagine these remarkable outliers as offering revolutionary possibilities for the future." That's so beautifully put, so very beautifully put. But I was talking about films, but I think it's very different when you read the example of CLR James. It's so beautiful, since many here would be ardent cricket lovers. Probably you could enlighten more about that particular chapter on CLR James and his take on cricket.
I don't know how many of you have read CLR James. I don't know if people still
Beyond
read
the
him.
Boundary.
Beyond the Boundary. It's if you love cricket, you have to read that book. It's just amazing. Of course, he's talking about, it's like early 20th century, so it's test cricket and white flannels and all that. But if anyone turned Neville Carter's, even I was a huge fan of cricket actually, even this was, and then I went to the US and I kind of lost touch with cricket, and I never got into IPL and all that, but so this was still the late 90s when I was in college. I was very into cricket. But, and I actually read this, people, and it's quite fascinating. If you read James, sports is almost a kind of an art. And I think these places, sports, films, the popular spaces, even literature used to be. Literature is no longer as popular. Obviously, it's become more of an intellectual pursuit. But in fundamentally, all the arts, I think, are open to amateurs. It's like when people say that, oh, you are studying English, so anybody can do that, okay. I am talking about thermodynamics, that's very difficult. I said, yeah, thank you, that's a great compliment. I like to think that I think about something which everyone does. That's the beauty of it. It's truly, arts are a subject for amateurs. And I think I'm glad you talked about the film people. So I'm sure that must be a huge, today's in bookstagrammers or TikTok and all of these things, they make such a huge thing. And at the same time, we know the traditional review spaces are kind of declining in importance, because obviously young generation, they're not paying attention to those, they're looking at that. But it's, I think it's really fascinating, because amateur criticism is a big hit and miss. You will find a lot of wild, crazy, really stupid judgments, but you will find gold also. You'll suddenly find gold, and you'll find something amazing, which the professional just cannot say something like that. It just cannot. Professionalism, every year when I talk to students who want to do English or creative writing, and they say that, oh, I love literature, I'm worried if I major in it, I'll stop loving it. I said, yeah, there's a fear of this. There's some truth in that fear. It may happen. You don't want to. And there are people who say that I love literature so much, I studied history. I didn't want to. So there's that, I think, in a sense, I think the arts, and I think this is true of all the arts, not just literature, music, filmmaking, I think there's always the place for the amateur. There's a kind of a productive tension between the amateur and the professional. And I think the more technical a field is, the more important professional training becomes. So in my personal opinion, the most technical art form is filmmaking. Filmmaking has so many technical things you need to learn. There's so many scientific engineering things that it makes sense to have, filmmaking. You can't really just have, even though today's digital cameras and all that make a lot of things possible, and technology is making, obviously the citizen filmmaker. But I still think there are things to be learned. Literature, on the other hand, I think is the least technical of all art forms, especially prose. Poetry, I think, is more technical than prose. So when people ask me, oh, can you really teach creative writing? I said, really, the real part of writing? No. It's like that famous story Richard Feynman told during Manhattan Project that, some army general said that, everybody logs in their hours when they work. Your scientists don't sign up for any hours. And he said, the problem is, my scientists get their best ideas when they're sleeping. So you can't really log the hours. So writing is a bit like that. What are you going to do in a class? Your ideas will come to you while you're dreaming, while you're eating, while you're in a relationship, while you're in the shower. So you can't really point it in a certain space. But we can bring people together, and one thing we do is to teach people how to read. So writers often have this magnet thing on the fridge: write drunk, edit sober. So you can write. Writing is a wild process. You can't keep track. But as an editor, you need a cold, sober rationality. And that is something that is teachable. Both them together, coming together, makes a good writer. So it's really fascinating. So I think, even, I did an MFA in the US, and there's a whole parody about, the MFA story. The story which is perfect in voice and point of view, but it's completely lifeless. And I think we've all seen works of art like this, whether it's a film or literature or music, that its technique is so good, but somehow there's no spark, there's no spirit. And the reverse is also true. You see something that is so wild and so passionate, but kind of rough on the edges. I'd much rather take the second kind. I'd much rather take something that is rough on the edges, but has that spark, rather than something which is technically perfect but has no spark in it. And that's why the importance of the amateur.
That's quite reassuring. Thank you. Thank you for making that statement. And I'm sure that's a point where the audience would like to interact with you. Thank you for the applause too. And yeah.
Hi. My question to you is, can creativity be taught? And don't you think it's an organic process? So does teaching helps it? Thank you.
That's exactly, thank you for the question. That's exactly what I was trying to get to. Now, creativity is a very big word. I mean, I think right now the word is owned by advertising people and marketing managers. They use the word creative more than we do. In fact, I think the word creative is, but I know what you mean. I think you have to look at the art form. I don't think it's possible to make a general statement. I think certain art forms really need, again, I don't know much about music, but I think if you're an aspiring classical musician, you cannot do it without training. There are certain things you must train. Same with filmmaking. Writing, I think, is a strange art form, because it's the only art form which is purely artificial. All art forms have a sensory component. Music appeals to the ears, painting appeals to the eye, sculpture appeals to the eye, films appeal to multiple senses. Writing is the only art form which uses language, which is a completely artificial medium. And even then, poetry has an oral element, theater, performance, but prose is, and I think this is something I tell my students, that remember, even the most neutral statement, he or she was wearing a blue shirt, means different thing to different people. The cup, shirt, everything is different. So it's a different thing, but I think because language is something we all use, I think in some ways it is the least technical. It's a medium we are all using, but I'm sure every artistic practitioner will have different things. What is very important and what is teachable is the appreciation of art.
Yeah.
And I don't think anybody can become an artist without being able to appreciate it. And this is kind of sad, because I think we're moving, often we see reading is coming down, but people are still writing. And I keep telling people that you cannot be a writer unless you read. You must read, you must know where you belong, who's your tradition. For me, as a Indian writer writing in English, this was hugely important. I read a lot in Bangla, I read a lot in English, but then I'm like, oh, can I really write about this culture in English? Or if I'm writing in English, all my characters must only drink scotch and listen to jazz and drive sports cars. And then I read Indian English writers who are talking about Indian kitchens, absolutely local food. I'm like, wow, this can be done. You can do it. You know, people like Rajarao, Arkit Narayan have done this. People like Shashi Deshpande, Amit Chaudhary. There's so many people who've actually talked about and for me that was very important. So I think you must appreciate, you must recognize your place in the community. You must recognize your place in the tradition. And these things can be taught. But there is a wild part of the creative process which cannot be taught, simply because that's an interaction between you and life. I always say there are two things you need to become a writer. You need an interesting relationship with life. Mind you, not an interesting life, because there's no such thing as an uninteresting life. Every life is interesting. Art is where you are. Don't go anywhere looking for art. Just where the place, it's like a shadow. You turn around, it's gone, but it's always there. And you need an interesting relationship with language that is free of cliches, language that can surprise and shock, not in a dramatic, sensational way, but in a simple way. So I think it depends on different art forms, but definitely the appreciation of art and creativity is teachable, and that is very important.
I found your definition of queer really interesting, because I struggle with it when queer actually means putting people into boxes. Like, I found we had a broader perspective before, and sometimes this definition of queer is very narrow. And what you said made me think that maybe to be a writer you have to be queer, because you have to enter the minds of people who are so different from you. And the narrow definition would say, oh, I could not write a novel from the perspective of a black man because I'm a white woman. But what are your thoughts on that? Sorry, I
think you put it really well. I completely agree. I think all writing is queer. I think all good writing is queer, because it is always aspiring to something impossible, something that is never realizable. If it's realizable, then I think it's not worth pursuing. Now, there are some problems here. Of course, this is where I think art and activism part company a little bit. I think when you are an activist, you need labels. You need to make laws, you need to create legislation, you need tags and labels, and that I completely understand. So the term gay, lesbian, those terms are very important. I think with art, I think you sometimes can work with labels. There are queer writers who are very clearly something or the other, but art can also afford to be gray, where you don't quite know where the desire is going. Something like pansexuality, something like something like childhood sexuality. I think the point you made about being different. See, the fascinating thing is very few of us can say, I was once a woman, now a man. Some people can, but it's a very small number. But all of us can say that I was once a child. And childhood is a great otherness which we all have within us. And if you look back, then this is something I always tell my students who are young, that you just left your childhood behind. Childhood is a time of great terror, great joy. Experience hits you heavily. You don't know what that means. So the gulf between experience and understanding is a great space for art. So in a way, the desires you felt as a child, I think most of us here, if you think of those desires, I think they will not quite fit in with who you are today. They will not quite fit in with the desires you feel, the desires you're conditioned to feel as an adult. I mean, once a Vietnamese American novelist told me that the first 5 years of life is all you need. That's a room material for a lifetime of fiction writing. I don't know if that's true, but I think that whole idea of otherness, and for me, the desires and terrors of childhood have been phenomenal, because I have been able to capture a completely different side of myself, which is not available to me anymore, including the sexualities. So I think we must capture these different points of othernesses within us as writers.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful point for us to wind up the session on. Let us all try to zero in on the queerness within each one of us and sublimate it creatively to write a better life for ourselves and for everyone else.
That's a beautiful note. That's really beautiful.
Thank you for
Content.
sharing
Thank you
that
so much.
wonderful.
Thank you, and thank you for all being
message.
here. And
Thank
for
you
your
very
questions.
much.